Greetings to all the friends of the channel. A few years ago, I went through a difficult period that affected every aspect of my life. In a moment of crisis, I made a radical decision. I packed my bags and left the city where I lived, without consulting anyone. I simply boarded a bus, leaving behind my job and my then partner. Fortunately, at that time, I had saved up a considerable amount of money, which allowed me to reach the bus station and buy a ticket to the first available destination, without asking what it was. I ended up in a city in the interior of Maranhão. As soon as I got off the bus, the first thing I did was look for a hotel to stay in for a few days while I found a house to rent. I had never been to that state before, so even though it was a city like any other, with its streets, houses, and businesses, the local architecture made a strong visual impact on me. While staying at the hotel, after spending my first night, I went to have breakfast at a small place across from the hotel. As I perused the newspaper for job opportunities, it seemed like my streak of bad luck had ended, as I found an advertisement looking for someone with a profile that matched mine. I called the number, was scheduled for an interview, and the meeting lasted about 40 minutes. In the end, they told me to start working the next day. The job was at a company that collected information from people and sold it to companies interested in advertising. The pay was good, but, of course, not enough to keep living in a hotel. Over time, I gained confidence with a coworker and mentioned that I was looking for a house to rent. I explained my budget, and he mentioned that there was a house available a few blocks away. He offered to accompany me, and after work, we arrived at the house before 6 p.m. It was a spacious house and well located, which was great for me because I never liked small spaces. Before knocking on the door to speak with the landlord, my coworker mentioned that there was a peculiar situation with that house. According to rumors, the landlord's deceased wife had made a pact with the devil, and people who rented the house didn't last long there. Despite this, I decided to proceed and speak with the owner. While talking to the landlord, we discussed the rental contract. I noticed a peculiarity. There was no minimum stay stipulated. I could leave the house whenever I wanted, but if I wanted to recover the deposit, I needed to give 3 weeks' notice. I asked the owner about this, but he changed the subject. I signed the contract, and the landlord told me that he would give me the keys the next day. When I arrived there the next day, the landlord was not present, so he left the keys in an envelope. That's when strange things began to happen. When I opened the door, it seemed like I could hear sounds coming from different parts of the house. However, since the house was empty, I thought maybe it was just the echo. That night, I had to sleep on the floor. The next day, I went to a furniture store and bought a bed and a small table. I soon noticed something strange. Whenever I entered the house, I felt sudden drowsiness. I decided to consult a doctor, but he found nothing wrong and suggested some vitamins. The symptoms persisted, and I ended up having recurring nightmares about a woman with a burned face. A coworker told me that those places in my nightmares were real in the city. When we visited them, we confirmed that they were the same places. He revealed to me that, before his parents passed away, they lived in the city and heard the story of the landlord's deceased wife. Supposedly, she had made a pact with the devil, which condemned her to a terrible death. This story left me disturbed, but I decided to stay in the house anyway. However, one night, while I was in the house, I heard knocking on the door. I went to the window and saw the same woman from my nightmares, with the burned face. I called the landlord and asked him to come to the house, as I was determined to leave. He agreed and reimbursed me part of the rent, understanding my situation. The story of that house and the haunted woman left me deeply disturbed. I decided to move on and leave that place behind, in search of peace and tranquility. Good evening. My father spent his entire life working as a singer. He never achieved national fame, but here in town and in the neighboring areas, he was a well-known artist. Obviously, I wanted to follow in his footsteps, but as I grew up, by the time I was 15, it became clear that I inherited my mother's genes, meaning I had no talent for singing, no matter how much I tried. I decided to dedicate myself to the arts, experimenting with different areas, until I discovered that I had a talent for dancing. Over the years, I joined a group, we won some contests, and we were hired for events. Over time, I saved up money. My father gifted me with a piece of land, and with the money I had saved, I built a small event hall, which would be my business. Thanks to the dance group, I met many people. My father had many friends due to his career, so clients were not lacking. For a good while, the business was thriving. The hall wasn't for very large events, at most for 100 people. This ended up being an advantage, as the price was much lower than that of a conventional hall, attracting clients for various types of events, such as bingo nights, year-end parties, student events, and so on. There were at least 10 events per month. I couldn't complain. However, one day an event arrived that was different from any other I had ever had before. Someone contacted me to rent the hall for a celebration of a 15th birthday party. Typically, these parties are large, as not only the family is invited, but also the families of everyone who collaborates on the event. I explained that the hall wasn't very large and invited the interested party to see it in person. They agreed and came to the hall, stating that they wanted to rent it for their goddaughter's 15th birthday. I asked if the ball would be very extravagant, as in that case, I would need to expand the central space, which would mean removing at least some tables, reducing the capacity from 100 to 60 people. The man said there was no problem with that, as they were not from the town and didn't have many acquaintances. If they could accommodate 60 people, that was fine. At that very moment, he made the full payment, we agreed on the date, and we signed the contract. Before leaving, the man asked me a favor. I couldn't refuse, since he had already given me all the money. He gave me a phone number and asked me to call a month before the party to inform that the hall was reserved, as it was a surprise and he hadn't told his compadres that he would pay for the hall. It seemed like a kind gesture to me. A month before the date, I called the number he had left. A lady answered, and I explained that I was the owner of the hall, informing that the date was reserved for the celebration of his daughter's 15th birthday, as the godfather had already paid for the hall. The lady, with a choked voice, which at that moment I thought was due to emotion, thanked me for the call and hung up. The day of the party arrived, and from early on, people started arriving to decorate the hall. I had a small room at the back of the hall and usually stayed there during events to resolve any unforeseen situations. I had cameras that allowed me to see everything that happened in the hall. So, from the beginning of the setup, I immediately noticed that something was out of the ordinary. The tablecloths had seams adorned with peculiar symbols, the metal centerpieces displayed unusual shapes, and the cake bore no resemblance to the typical one at a 15th birthday party. I had the impression that these people might be connected to an unusual belief. The gentleman who had made the payment mentioned that the family was not local, which led me to think that perhaps that type of decoration was common in their region of origin. However, as the party began and the debutante made her entrance accompanied by the gentleman of honor, the strangeness increased. The young woman was not wearing the typical debutante dress, but rather an outfit that barely covered the essentials. Moreover, all the gentlemen of honor wore masks resembling demons and wielded swords. Despite this extravagance, the party proceeded somewhat normally. The music was contemporary, the food, though elegant, did not deviate from the conventional, and people enjoyed themselves as in any other celebration. However, the situation spiraled out of control with the arrival of the godfather. The gentleman who had rented the hall was dressed in a wine-colored overcoat, fading into black, and wielded a cane adorned with a golden figure on the handle. Upon entering the hall, the debutante walked to the center of the room, followed by her masked gentlemen of honor, forming a circle around her with their raised swords, as if creating a dome. The gentleman then kissed the debutante. Upon realizing the oddity of the situation, I left my office in an attempt to intervene, but was prevented by the relatives present. The debutante's father approached me, tears in his eyes, pleading with me not to interfere. He exclaimed that things should proceed this way and hurled insults, questioning what kind of sick father would allow such a situation during a party. He ordered me not to meddle in matters I didn't understand, and I threatened to call the police. Then, the gentleman, visibly distressed, begged me not to interfere, promising to explain everything, but asking me to allow the events to unfold as planned. I was shocked by what I witnessed, and the sounds reverberated throughout the room. I threatened the gentleman, informing him that the cameras were recording everything and that if he did not provide an explanation that justified such atrocity in the end, everyone would be taken to jail. I couldn't bear the situation any longer, so I left the hall. After some time, the guests began to leave the venue, visibly shaken. I returned to the hall, but found neither the masked individuals nor the godfather. The debutante's grandparents were helping her up from the floor. She seemed completely unconscious. Quickly, I approached the father and demanded an explanation. He asked us to go where the cameras were to talk. Arriving there, he revealed to me that his daughter was born with 4 heart murmurs. Doctors said she had no chance of surviving more than a week. He was not willing to allow his only daughter to die so unfairly. He left his wife in the hospital and set out determined to find a cure for his daughter. He swore to his wife that he would find it, even if it put his life at risk. He found a solution to save her and called the whole family for a meeting at the hospital. There, he shared that he had found an alternative. A priest with peculiar beliefs assured him that he could guarantee his daughter's life until she turned 15. However, for that, he would have to hand her over to the priest, promising to do so when she turned 15. The priest assured him that she would remain healthy and safe until that day, without falling ill or suffering accidents. No matter if there were any unforeseen events, because nothing bad would happen to her until the designated day for delivery. The only condition was to keep her away from any man, as she should exclusively belong to the priest. The father reported that the whole family fell silent upon hearing this, but he assured that it was the only way to save the girl's life. His wife was the first to agree to the proposal, and his parents and in-laws, although reluctant, accepted it as the only viable solution. After a joint discussion, everyone agreed to help ensure that the girl did not come into contact with any man, not even friends or boyfriends. Finally, the father met again with the mysterious priest and offered his daughter in exchange for the promise to keep her alive. The supposed godfather was, in fact, the priest himself, and what happened at the end of the party was that he came to claim what had been agreed upon as payment. Evidently, I doubted the man's words. It seemed like he was making everything up. To prevent me from handing over the recordings to the authorities, however, he assured me that I could prove it right at that moment. He pointed to the cameras and said, "Review them." I didn't understand why he wanted me to do that, but I obeyed. I was shocked when I played back what was recorded. When the debutante entered with her masked gentleman, only the girl was seen on the cameras. The masked individuals did not appear on any of the 4 cameras. It was evident that she danced the waltz. And even worse, when it happened with the godfather, only the girl was seen on the cameras. The godfather did not appear either. I was speechless with surprise. The man, very serious, stated that the godfather was the devil, and the masked ones, angels of evil. His daughter was not taken unconscious, she was already lifeless. I had no choice but to believe the man. I turned to him and asked why he was there explaining instead of mourning the death of his daughter. He replied that he had cried when he was told that she would not live for more than a week. The 15 years she lived, thanks to him, were a gift. There was no reason to be sad, on the contrary. Although, of course, the death of his daughter hurt, he was grateful for having kept her alive for 15 years. I felt so sorry for that man that I apologized to him after some of the guests left. While I remained in the office, trying to process what had just happened in my hall, 2 weeks passed and I was contacted by a church. They wanted to organize a dinner to celebrate the 40th anniversary of a priest service. He wanted to see the hall, so we arranged a time and date to show it to him. When the day came and we were there, I opened the doors for the priest. As soon as I saw him, a man almost 80 years old turned to me with a horrified expression and said that my hall was a place repudiated by God. I, like the people accompanying him, was perplexed by his words. The priest added, "You have opened the doors to evil." The priest asked to leave, and what the man said left me very worried. After that day, no one else called me to rent the hall for a long time. I only received income from people who were settling previous accounts, but I couldn't attract new customers, not even by advertising or offering the venue at half price. No one else was interested in my hall. On the day after the last scheduled event, when there were no more pending events in the hall, a fire broke out and it was completely destroyed. I believe that my hall was cursed after that damned 15-year-old party. A few years ago, I worked part-time at a chain of restaurants in Mexico, a family-owned branch specializing in seafood and fish. I started at 5 p.m. and left at closing, which was at 10 p.m. I remember starting there because of a girl I was interested in who also worked there. It was a way for me to spend more time around her, hoping to at least have a chance. To be honest, she was out of my league. It hadn't been a month since I started there when, while we were getting everything ready to close, we were talking about bad experiences with customers. That's when the shift supervisor came up with the idea of telling us about unexplained incidents that happened from time to time. He mentioned, for example, that a child about 5 years old used to call the restaurant around midnight, among other equally curious things. Obviously, questions arose. The question I asked was how a child of that age could call a restaurant at midnight. The shift supervisor replied that the story said that this child had died on the site before the branch was built. The parents were searching for treasure and found it on that land, but what these parents didn't know was that the treasure was cursed. Anyone who wished for even a small part of it would have to offer something in return. The parents' ambition was so great that they offered their daughter's life. So, they handed her over exactly at midnight. That's why the child would call at that time, and if someone answered, what the child asked for was to be unearthed from there, as she was afraid. I must confess that this narrative gave me chills, especially because since childhood I've always heard stories about a supposed cursed treasure buried somewhere in the city, and anything related to it always frightened me a lot. Still, I didn't completely believe the story. The part about the treasure and the dead child, yes, but the idea of calling the restaurant seemed made up by the shift supervisor. Time passed, and one night around 9:30, some customers came in and ordered the most expensive dishes and drinks on the menu. With only 5 minutes left until 10 p.m., they requested something else. Our closing time was at 10, but since we figured they would leave a good tip due to their consumption, we closed so no one else would come in, but we continued serving them. Without rushing, they finished around 11:45, and the bill was over $1,500. The customers knew our closing time was at 10, so as a gesture of gratitude, they left a $300 tip, which we split among those who stayed to serve them. After they left, we started cleaning up to close. It was evident that we would leave after midnight that day. To everyone's surprise, including the shift supervisor, exactly at midnight, the phone rang. We were all silent. The girl I liked was the bravest of all there. She said she would answer, and no one objected. She went to the phone, picked up, and hung up in less than 2 seconds. She had a pale face. We asked what had happened, and she said it was a child, but she didn't hear what the child wanted because she was scared and hung up. The shift supervisor gave her a Coca-Cola to calm down and also mentioned that at least a year had passed since anyone had been at the branch at midnight. For that reason, he didn't recall the sensation of hearing the phone ring at that moment. We asked if he had ever heard the voice of that child, but he said no. He was aware that this happened, as he had been working at the branch for over 5 years, alongside the colleague. There were already more than 10 different employees who had answered the phone and heard the child. We didn't dwell on it, but I believe, without a doubt, that we all agreed not to want to be there again at that hour. About 3 months passed, and then, one night, as we were closing, the topic of that call came up, and we remembered the other information that the shift supervisor had provided us. We asked him if the others were also true, and he confirmed, but that all the other situations only occurred during the night of November 1st. The night of November 1st arrived. The girl I liked had requested permission not to work that day, as she was very shaken after answering the call from the child on that occasion. We were instructed that, since November 1st is the Day of the Dead for children here in Mexico, a 10% discount would be granted to all children who showed up in costume or with minimal makeup. When I arrived at 5 p.m. to work, the first thing I noticed was that there were more children than usual. Closing time came, but when one of the colleagues went to check the women's restroom, they noticed it was occupied. There were no more occupied tables, and we didn't remember any customers who had come to the restaurant alone, but we supposed they might be waiting outside. Soon they would leave. We left precisely for that reason and continued with our tasks. After 15 minutes, the person still hadn't left the bathroom. We knew it was occupied because it could only be locked from the inside. We knocked on the door, but no one responded. We called out, but there was no answer. Then, the shift supervisor instructed us to open the door, which could be unlocked with a screwdriver. When we did, we found no one inside. Suddenly, we heard a sound, a noise. We turned and saw a cutting board that had fallen to the floor. Someone went to pick it up to put it back in its place, and as they did, a frying pan also fell. We all looked at each other, without uttering a word. The manager looked at the clock. It was just a little past 11. He asked us not to panic and to hurry to finish before the phone rang. We chose to leave the frying pan on the floor and pick it up when there was nothing else to do. At 11:30, we were about to leave when someone tried to put the frying pan back in its place, but as they did, it shattered. Immediately after, the door to the women's restroom slammed shut. We all looked at the door, which then opened again, and the light inside began to flicker rapidly. Amidst the various flashes of light, for a moment, it seemed to us that we saw a girl inside the bathroom. The shift leader requested that we head to the exit, but when he inserted the key to unlock it, it wouldn't turn. He tried with 3 other keys, but none worked. Then, the phone rang. It was already midnight. I was closest to the phone, and for some reason, I pressed the button to answer, automatically putting it on speakerphone. We all heard the voice of a girl asking to be taken out of there. That's all she said before the call ended. Afterward, the key turned, and we were finally able to leave. That was the last shift I worked at that restaurant. A few years ago, I found myself at the lowest point in my life. I lost. I'm not exaggerating when I say I was living a nightmare. It was a culmination of mistakes and disappointments since childhood. Everything always went wrong for me. I was the fat, glasses-wearing kid in school. Everyone teased me about it. I decided not to continue studying in high school, which made it hard for me to find a good job. When my parents passed away, I found myself alone in a house I couldn't even afford to pay the water and electricity bills for. I was in poverty and loneliness. Hope vanished like smoke between my fingers, and desperation became my only constant companion. From the depths of my hopelessness, I decided to seek a solution that could change the course of my life. When I was living on the streets, I went to a church to ask for help, but the priest refused to even give me food. That made me harbor some resentment. I harbored resentment against the church itself, not against God per se, so the idea of invoking and making a pact with evil arose. Of course, I had no idea how to do that, so I put it aside for a while. Sleeping on the streets, starving and cold, doesn't leave much time for thinking. One early morning, a peculiar-looking elderly man arrived at the park where I was sleeping. Despite appearing not to have bathed for several days, he still had an elegant appearance, not refined, but elegant. He asked if he could sit next to me. I hesitated for a moment, but then he took out a piece of bread from his coat and offered me half. I quickly moved aside so the elderly man could sit. We were there, and we started talking, and I told him how I ended up in that situation. When I finished, the old man looked into my eyes and said he could change my fate, that the only thing I needed to do was to shake his hand firmly. When he said those words, I felt a cold breeze move my hair, but my desire to change my life was so great that, despite having a bad feeling, I didn't ask any questions and shook the old man's hand. He grinned from ear to ear, congratulated me, and then got up, ensuring we would meet again when I had a better life. The next day, as I walked through the city, hoping for something to happen, I ran into the only friend I had in elementary school. He was teased because he was always small, and at that time, when I found him on the street, he must have been less than 1.55 meters tall. He was my only friend. Acquaintance, I took the blows for him. His name was Anthony, and he was very pleased to see me. He invited me to eat. To cut the story short, Anthony was doing very well. He owned a very important company in the state and offered me a job as head of his security team. I explained that I had no idea how to do this job well. That wasn't an obstacle. He said he trusted me for what I had done for him when we were kids. He told me to take some courses and then I got the job. I made a lot of money, moved back into my parents' house, and with money started frequenting fancy places. There, women approached me. My life was at a level I could never have imagined. Much my new life for several months. One morning, I woke up feeling a small emptiness in my stomach. It wasn't hunger, it didn't hurt or burn, it just felt like something was missing. I worried enough to go to the doctor, who found nothing out of the ordinary. After that morning, gradually, the things that used to make me enjoy my new life began to lose their meaning. I wasn't a millionaire, but since I had never had money, I had already bought everything I had ever wanted. I no longer knew what to do with the money they still paid me. In a period of 5 months, I went from having a different woman every weekend to not even going out for a drink. Luxuries and comforts lost their charm, and I found myself surrounded by material things that didn't make me feel good. Objects that didn't provide me with anything and only fed my sense of emptiness. That's how, despite living in a house full of everything any family would want, I felt devastated, actually. There was a moment when I wouldn't sleep in bed. I'd lie on the floor because my mood was the same as when I slept on that cold, lonely bench in the park. One of the many late nights, there was a knock on my door one night. When I went to open it, it was that strange-looking old man. I invited him in, offered him something to eat and a beer. The old man seemed very pleased to see me. I didn't even understand how he had gotten to my house. We met in a park. It didn't make sense, but still, that complete stranger was there, sitting in my living room, looking at me with a wide smile. He asked me if I liked my new life. Instead of answering, I asked him a question. "Who are you?" The old man, still smiling, replied that I knew very well that he wanted to talk to me, but didn't know how. That gave me chills. This old man was insinuating he was evil incarnate. With a slightly trembling voice, I commented that I had no idea what he was talking about. The old man quickly finished the bread and beer, got up from the couch, and headed towards the door. Before leaving, he told me he had only visited me to make sure I was very clear that he had fulfilled his part of the deal and that, upon dying, I would fulfill mine. Then he closed the door and left. I guess it should have been obvious since he arrived with me at the park. But honestly, I never stopped to think about what I was doing. Now it seems like no matter what happens, I'm going to end up in hell. Greetings to everyone on the channel. I've always maintained that bars are spaces where an infinity of narratives of all kinds unfold. Although the most common ones are those of romantic disillusionment, from time to time, in these places imbued with the smell of cigarette smoke and alcohol, extraordinarily strange and dark stories emerge. The narrative I share below is precisely about that. I work in a bar that has been operating for over 77 years in Corumbá, Mato Grosso do Sul, founded by my grandfather in 1945. This place witnessed my father growing up, and currently, it's me who manages it, hoping to one day pass it on to my young son. When I was just a young man of about 19 years old, I started working here. My father taught me how to prepare drinks and serve customers, mainly working-class men or laborers from the region. This dates back to the early 2000s, the late 90s, when I took my first steps as a bartender. On one of those afternoons, an older gentleman entered the doors of this establishment. Many strands of white hair were already noticeable, not only on his head but also in his pronounced mustache. He went straight to the counter, without much hesitation, and gestured for me to serve him. The gentleman took off his hat and ordered a beer with some peanuts to snack on. I had never seen him in the bar, let alone in the area. He must be a newcomer, I thought, although, to be honest, the gentleman was dressed like a cowboy, wearing jeans, a checkered shirt, and black boots. He didn't seem to be a local worker. Calmly, he drank his beer and ate some peanuts, staying for about 20 minutes just observing and experiencing his one beer. When he finished, he asked me to charge him. When paying, he took out a coin from his pocket. It was a peculiar coin, I had never seen it before. I told him that this coin had no value, that he should pay with valid currency. The gentleman retorted, "This coin is worth more than everything you're wearing. If you don't believe me, ask your grandfather." He left me contemplative with his words, and without realizing it, and unable to stop him, he walked out the door of the bar that night, as we were closing with my father. I showed my father the coin with which the man had paid. I thought my father would scold me for letting him go without paying. However, upon seeing that piece of metal, my father was speechless. "Who gave you this? This coin is worth a lot." "It's pure gold," my father said. I asked how he knew, and he replied, "Your grandfather, may he rest in peace, showed me one of these when I was a little younger than you. It was thanks to several of these that he was able to open this bar. I'm surprised that there are still people who keep them. I can't believe they almost gave it to you." In the emotion of the moment, I didn't tell my father the part where the gentleman said to ask my grandfather about the value of the coin. I simply thought that maybe he had known him for some time, and I left it at that. The next day, the same man came in the afternoon, dressed the same way. He sat in the same place and ordered a beer. I thanked him for the gesture of the coin, as I already knew its value. The gentleman just smiled and continued drinking. When it was time to settle the bill, he pulled out a coin similar to the one he had given me before. I indicated that I couldn't accept it, and the gentleman, calm, said, "Don't worry, young man. I have plenty of these. Just do me a favor. Don't tell anyone, not even your father. Keep the coins. Perhaps later you'll open your own business, like your grandfather." From that moment on, the gentleman would appear every afternoon, punctually at 3 o'clock, to enjoy a beer and some peanuts. With each payment, he would hand me a coin similar to the others. As the days went by, his presence became habitual, and naturally, I gained more confidence to ask him some questions. "Sorry, are you new around here?" "No, young man, I'm just passing through. I came to check on some pending matters." "I see. I apologize for asking, but did you know my grandfather?" "You could say so. I only met him once, many years ago, when your father wasn't even born yet. You can imagine how old I am and how much time has passed since then. And by the way, what's your name? Call me by whatever name each place I go. I'm known differently." "Then tell me, how would you prefer to be called?" I was confused by what he said last. In the end, I simply called him Sir. The gentleman continued to frequent the bar daily, regardless of the weather or the day of the week. He always showed up at the same time, asking for exactly the same thing. He dressed the same way every day and never interacted with anyone else. I believe he has accumulated almost 60 gold coins, all kept in a wooden box. Stored at the back of my closet, I had no idea how much that was worth in money, but I was convinced it was a fortune. On any given afternoon, the gentleman was at the bar having his beer when he said to me, "Hey, young man, tomorrow I'm leaving for my lands. My affairs are almost settled, but before I go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Can I meet you tomorrow around 6 p.m. at the kiosk in the park? I have something I'd like to give you, and I believe you'll appreciate it. What a pity, you've been one of our best customers for months." After that, he left the bar. What a mysterious man, I thought. The next day, I asked my father for permission without giving too many details and went to meet that gentleman at the agreed-upon location, near a monument. He was dressed the same way. "Good afternoon, sir. I see you're already here." "That's good, young man. I'm glad to see you." "Oh, do you know how your grandfather founded the bar?" "My father told me he worked in the mine for years, saved money, and then opened the bar with his savings." "Well, it was almost like that, but not exactly." Another question, do you believe him? "I don't know. I suppose so." "Why?" The moment I finished the sentence, a strange shiver ran through my whole body. I froze. "Look at this coin, young man. This is coin number 66. Decades ago, a young man almost your age, all clumsy, drunk, and vicious, found me on these almost deserted streets. At the time, they were just hills. I introduced myself to him and said I was the devil. He didn't believe it, but to prove it was true, he said that if I made him rich, he would give me his soul. I accepted. He said he would give him 666 pieces of pure gold. With them, he could have anything he wanted, but when he spent them all, I would come for him. Do you know what your grandfather did? The ingrate invested them, used them to buy the bar where you work. I managed to get 1 gold coin, hoping never to spend it, so his soul would never go with me. I thought he would spend them at the bar when the contract ended, but no. And now you have 665 pieces of gold, the same ones your grandfather had at the time. I want to propose the same deal. Do whatever you want with them. Today they are worth more than before. Believe me, I'll give you this last coin. Do you accept the deal? If not, I'll leave. I want to see if you are as clever as your grandfather or if your soul will go with me in a week. Tell me what you think. Do you accept the deal?" Every word he said, I blindly believed. Without a doubt, I was facing the Lord of the Underworld himself. But I couldn't believe that my grandfather had made a deal with him, let alone that he would be able to trick him. For a moment, I thought that if my grandfather could escape him, I could too. But what if I failed? I would have to go with him forever. Those minutes were eternal for me. I was frozen, unable to move, to do anything but think about accepting the deal or letting him go. No, I didn't accept. That was my final decision. I didn't want to resort to such trickery to move forward. Besides, the consequences of this act could be disastrous. My grandfather was lucky to have gotten away unscathed, but I'm sure I wouldn't. The gentleman lowered his gaze with a disappointed expression. Young man, think carefully. This opportunity doesn't come again." I reaffirmed my decision. I didn't thank him for the gesture. After that, my body started to feel more alive, my hands and legs began to move again. The gentleman simply said goodbye and walked away through the streets as the night began to fall on the edges of that confused town. I finished my shift at the bar with my father, to whom I hadn't said anything until now. It's hard to believe how my grandfather founded that bar. When I checked the box where I kept the gold coins, I realized that they had all disappeared. There was absolutely nothing. It was then that I knew I hadn't dreamed it, it wasn't a hallucination, and that the man in cowboy attire who appeared to me was the devil himself. To this day, I continue working at the bar, and something tells me that the time I saw that gentleman wasn't the first nor will it be the last. Greetings, everyone. Kate, my descendant, a sweet, insightful, and extremely polite girl, my partner treated her with great affection. I, to be honest, always kept a certain distance, dedicating most of my time to work, from weekdays to weekends. My youth was marked by deprivation, and I didn't want my descendant to experience the same. I missed her first communion, the elementary school celebration, and also her prom. I never accompanied her to school. She was my descendant, but in reality, she was a complete stranger to me. I understand that many parents experience the same situation as I do, and I realize that as offspring mature, the bond strengthens. However, in my case, there was a setback. My partner passed away in a car accident while on her way to pick up my descendant from school. I was informed by an acquaintance. The incident occurred near a place where we used to dine. An employee who knew us well identified the vehicle, approached, took my partner's phone, and contacted me. I vividly remember his words, "I'm sorry to bother you, but your partner has just been involved in an incident. There's no need to come, it's better to go pick up your descendant." Even without explicitly expressing it, he made it clear that there was nothing more to be done for my partner. My descendant blamed me for her mother's departure, stating that I should have been in the vehicle and that if I didn't dedicate so much time to work, her mother would still be present. That episode occurred approximately a decade ago. Subsequently, I left my profession and sought another that would allow me to be both a provider and a parent simultaneously. 2 of my sisters volunteered to assist in caring for my descendant, but I chose to take on the responsibility myself. There was an abrupt transformation in my existence. Within 2 months, I went from being unaware of my descendant's evaluations to memorizing the names of all her classmates and educators. I became overly cautious, worrying excessively about her protection and well-being. Kate, my descendant, had the appearance of a fairy tale princess. Identical to her mother, her hair was long and straight, with a beautiful dark shade like obsidian. However, since her mother's departure, her face no longer displayed smiles. Her once lively eyes now seemed dull and devoid of sparkle. My descendant was not happy. I suppose my excessive caution was oppressive to her. Her mother was her confidant, they shared common interests and activities together. I was just a man struggling to balance, trying to be a good parent. Now I can understand, but at that time, I was unable to perceive. What I did was supervise each of her activities. I didn't allow her to go out with her peers, although I allowed them to visit our home. Within the household, she could do whatever she wanted, even receive money to order pizza or anything she desired. What I didn't realize at that moment was that I was actually taking away her freedom. I tried to lighten the tense atmosphere by making jokes, attempted to start conversations about music or movies, but nothing worked. She remained immersed in her sadness, and I was trapped in a nightmare, the meaning of failing as a father. I erred too much by overprotecting her in this way. I should have given her more space. However, desperate to establish at least a minimal connection with my daughter, I sneaked into her room to read the diary I knew her mother had given her. It wasn't difficult to find it, but what I didn't expect was for the diary to have a small lock. I began to try to force it open. The problem was that on that day, my daughter left early and didn't call to let me know. She just went home alone. I was so focused on trying to open that lock that I didn't hear anything until my daughter walked into the room and found me with her diary in hand. Her reaction was anger because she considered the diary a treasure, a special gift from her mother, and her only way to vent. That afternoon, my daughter decided it was time to teach me a lesson. I know that now because I discovered the truth later. The next morning, she came to my room to tell me she was going to school alone and threw the diary in my face. I thought it was really her diary, but it wasn't. She had bought an identical diary online and started writing all kinds of falsehoods and obscenities with the clear intention of making me angry. When I began flipping through this fake diary, I found notes about a supposed older boyfriend with whom she had secret meetings when she skipped school. I also found pages that narrated fictional episodes of substance abuse and about sending sexy photos to this boyfriend. Illusory, there were entire pages detailing alleged celebrations that occurred in the early hours while I slept. However, that wasn't the most concerning part. My daughter decided to add in the last pages that she had been enjoying the darkness since her mother's death. It had details about rituals that seemed quite persuasive, and she adorned these diary pages with symbols and inverted crosses. She even included some strange phrases that, upon researching on the internet, I found to be malevolent Latin phrases. I believe any father would be disturbed to think that his daughter was actually following everything written in that fake diary. I spent the whole morning pondering what I should do about it. In the end, I concluded that I had no right to say anything, as I had not respected her privacy. As they say, if you look for trouble, you'll find it. The following week, Kate's behavior seemed to confirm the sinister implications about worship that I found in that fake diary. Her attitude, although already distant with me, began to turn dark in her everyday interactions. She used small expressions that were not typical of someone her age. They were things that sounded very intellectual, but at the same time caused discomfort at home. She began to dress in black, wearing clothes with symbolism related to occultism and Satanism. I tried to forbid her from wearing these garments. But she told me that it was the only thing she wanted to wear, and that I could throw them away, but then she would choose to walk naked down the street. I literally lost control of the situation. Kate began to stay awake until late at night. Sometimes, I would hear whispers and murmurs coming from her room, but when I tried to approach the door, she would scream at me not to even think about entering her room. I believe that, even to make me believe that everything was true, she started to convince herself that she loved what was dark. One afternoon, when picking up my daughter from school, outside the house, I encountered an elderly woman. She had so many wrinkles on her face that her eyes could barely be seen. The woman was sitting on the sidewalk holding a rosary of black beads and strange rectangular medallions of leather. I had to speak to her because to get my car out I had to pass exactly where she was sitting. I approached and kindly asked her to move from my sidewalk. She stared at me and asked who I was. Her question seemed very strange and completely out of context. I assumed that the woman was suffering from mental problems. So I simply repeated that she had to leave immediately. The old woman, moving her hands in a way that seemed to be counting the black beads of the rosary, asked if I was Kate's father. The tone of voice with which she asked me raised a lot of suspicion, so I warned her that if she didn't leave, I would run over her with the car. The old woman struggled to get up, said there would be time for me to answer her questions later, and walked away. I picked up my daughter. We went back home, and the day unfolded as uncomfortable and tense as the past few weeks had been. The next day, which was Saturday, I practically spent the whole day working, as due to my extensive resume. I had arranged with my employer to work only 6 hours a day during the week, making up for the 14 pending hours on Saturdays and Sundays. That Saturday, when I left the office for a break and to grab something to eat, I encountered the same old woman who had been sitting on my sidewalk before. Before I could say anything, she stepped forward and said that I needed to listen to her for the sake of my daughter. It seemed highly unlikely that the old woman was just a crazy person, as she had been waiting for me outside my workplace, with the sole intention of telling me something. So, I decided to listen to her. She said her name was Lily and that she had more news for me. She said that the diary I had read was fake, that my daughter had deceived me. However, in her effort to maintain the deception, my daughter had contacted her husband and, indeed, was following everything that was written down, even though the diary was fake. This didn't bother her, as my daughter wasn't the first to seek her husband. The problem was that if her husband decided to pay attention to my daughter, she would be dead. I didn't understand what she was telling me, but I made it clear that she shouldn't threaten my daughter, as I wouldn't allow her to lay a hand on her. The lady laughed and told me that she wouldn't do anything, as she wasn't interested in what my daughter sought in her husband. She claimed that it would be he who would kill her. After saying that, the woman began to cross the street, walking right in the middle. When I raised my voice and asked who her husband was, she turned around and answered me, as strange as it may sound. I heard her voice right next to my ear. What she told me was, "My husband is the enemy." At that moment, a car passed right over her. It should have hit her, but the lady disappeared before my eyes before the car touched her. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Even hunger disappeared. I went back to the office and continued working, completing my hours as usual. At 11:30 at night, as I drove home, I thought about the words of that lady. I hadn't understood half of what she said, but she seemed to know exactly what she was talking about. Moreover, the woman disappeared before my eyes. When I arrived home, I found all the lights turned off, which wasn't normal because my daughter had always been a bit afraid of the dark. Therefore, she always left at least 2 lights on, or at the very least, turned on the bathroom light and left the door open. So, I immediately knew something was wrong. I closed the door and flicked the switch to my right, just to ensure there was light. As soon as I moved the switch, the living room light turned on. I shouted my daughter's name as I dropped my things on the couch, but got no response. I kept repeating her name as I hurried to her room. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I tried to turn the doorknob, but it was locked from the inside. Quickly, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a spoon, and used it to unlock the door. The latch wasn't complicated at all. Entering my daughter's room, the first thing I saw was her lying on the floor, surrounded by several candles already burned down. I didn't hesitate to try to wake her up. Quickly, I lifted her up and ran to the car, aiming to take her to the hospital as fast as possible. I knew we didn't have health insurance, and the nearest hospital was private, known to be the most expensive in the city. Anyway, I drove there and went straight to the emergency room. Some nurses, upon seeing the situation, quickly approached, followed by a doctor who took her. They asked me to sit down and assured me that someone would speak to me soon. The time I spent sitting in the waiting room, though only a few minutes, felt like an eternity. Finally, a doctor approached with a serious expression on his face. He asked me to follow him to a meeting room, where he made sure there was no one around who could overhear us. Then, he explained that Kate had regained consciousness, but her behavior was extremely unusual and concerning. They had to transfer her to another floor, to a more suitable room. Very nervous, I asked what he meant. The doctor detailed the symptoms my daughter had presented upon waking up: uncontrollable laughter and crying, spasms, and delusions. He added that she had adopted aggressive behavior, attempting to scratch and bite a nurse, resulting in her already being restrained. They wanted to sedate her, but she was not responding to anesthesia. I asked the doctor to let me see her, and he agreed, but warned that it would have a very strong impact. He cautioned me that if I had any heart or pressure problems, it would be better not to see her until she stabilized. I agreed, and the doctor escorted me back to the reception. To complete my daughter's admission record, I headed to the room where she was being taken. The doctor asked if my daughter had experienced similar episodes before. He also wanted to know if there was a history of mental health problems in the family, including whether she had recently undergone any traumatic experiences. I told him that my daughter had always been healthy, that no one in the family had been diagnosed with anything like that, and that the only thing that had happened was her mother's death, but it had been months ago. When we arrived at the room, my daughter was indeed restrained, struggling to free herself. I asked the doctor how it was possible for her to have ended up like this out of nowhere. He responded with medical terms, but from what I understood, he said that it was likely that she had suffered a very strong blow to the head, which, in the worst-case scenario, could cause a brain injury, leading to personality changes and hostile behavior. It was like a cold shower. My daughter was at risk of being like this forever, and I didn't even understand why. I tried to approach her to talk, but she was out of it, seeming not to recognize me. So, I decided to leave the room and went back to the cafeteria. I needed a coffee. When I registered that the service was already included in the private room, the attendant gave me a voucher to show at the cafeteria. I could choose whatever I wanted without paying because it was included in the hospital stay. With coffee in hand, I went to see what they had to eat. I only took some food to eat quickly and spend the night with my daughter. Just as I sat down, a mysterious woman sat next to me. Swiftly, she glanced around, but told me that no one else could see her except me. She commented that there was nothing more to be done for my daughter, that she had captured the attention of her husband and now had no salvation. She recommended that I go up with my daughter and stay there, as she would die at any moment. I didn't respond, just left the plate and coffee and ran to the room where my daughter was. As I turned the corner, I could see several people inside the room. I couldn't tell if they were doctors or nurses, but they were doing something. When I arrived, they tried to stop me from entering, but I pushed past them. My daughter was convulsing violently, bleeding from her eyes and ears, but the expression on her face showed a disturbing smile. Then, she began to scream words that I had never heard before. I had no idea what she was saying. She screamed, and I could see blood flowing from her teeth. Everyone present was handling equipment, uttering words, and pointing in all directions. Some were holding syringes. I just watched, seeing my daughter dying. Then, I pushed everyone aside and approached Kate, holding her hand. At that moment, she looked at me and said, "Daddy." Shortly after, her body relaxed. She was gone. I buried her next to her mother. For a week, I slept in the car parked outside the cemetery. I didn't have the courage to go back home, but eventually, I had to. As I parked the car on the sidewalk where I had first encountered the woman, I remembered what she had told me. I went to my daughter's room and found her real diary, locked. I broke it and read it from the first page. It became clear that this was not the diary I had read. I kept searching and found the one I had read. The woman had told the truth. My daughter had deceived me. So, I thought, if the woman had told the truth about this, it meant she had told the truth about everything. I opened the fake diary and went to the pages where she had noted different rituals. There, I found a drawing showing a circle made of candles and a woman unconscious in the center, just like the scene I had witnessed. The candles were still there from when I took my daughter to the hospital. I began reading the notes she made about this ritual. It said the purpose was to attract the demon's attention with the sole intention of making a request. If he wasn't interested, nothing would happen, but if he accepted, any wish would be granted in exchange for taking the requester's soul as soon as they proved their wish had been fulfilled. I went to the last page of the diary. The date was recent, and there was only one sentence. "I think I can talk to Mommy." I glanced away from the written text and noticed that inside the circle of consumed candles was my daughter's cell phone, which I hadn't seen before. I picked it up, but it was already dead. I searched for a charger, and after a while, it turned on. Reviewing the last text message she received, it was from the phone number that used to be her mother's. The text said, "Why did you do this, my daughter? If you've made it this far, tell us where you heard our stories and mention the phrase, dark pacts. Don't forget to give us a hand by liking, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and sharing the video with your friends who enjoy this type of content. A big hug, and keep browsing the channel. Here you will find incredible and frightening horror stories to relax and enjoy.